self, and the existentialists emphasize uh, the freedom of choosing who you're going to be, and yet there's no getting around the fact that much of our sense of who we are is in fact a social construct, uh, de- defined in relationship with other people and with our society in general. I mean, think about, for example, how I would respond if somebody says, "Well, tell me about yourself." Well, I'm a professor at Grambling State. Okay, that defines me in terms of a kind of social identity, what I do for a living. Um, and of course, that carries with it um, expectations about how I'm going to act, what I behavioral expectations, role expectations. I'm supposed to try to teach you. That's kind of my job, right? Um, I might add, I'm also a United Methodist minister. I no longer serve as pastor of a church. I have enough to do um, as a professor at Grambling, but my church recognizes uh, my teaching as my ministry. In fact, in the Journal of the Florida Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, my appointment is listed as Professor of Humanities, Grambling State University. Uh, I'm a husband. I'm a father. Uh, I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, grew up in Winter Park, Florida. Okay, I mean that we identify ourselves in terms of social groups. The problem with that becomes especially clear, however, when the the social identity that is put on you by society um, is a negative one. And Malcolm X talks about that in two short excerpts that we have. Um, these are not from, uh, well, they're collected into a book, but it's some of his speeches. Um, in the first one, uh, he argues that African Americans would be better off to identify themselves simply as African, um, because remember when he's doing this in the early '60s. That's before the desegregation laws really took effect, and he talked about how going into a restaurant and passing yourself off as simply African, and you would get served. Because, as strange as it sounds to you, and frankly to me, at the time that I was born in 1956, it was illegal in most southern states for restaurants to serve both black and white people. Um, it really is odd. Um, but nonetheless, that's the way it was. And that carries with it a kind of a negative image that is present in our society of black people, and which is often placed on you. Um, Frankly, I think that one of the reasons why we have a level of violence by police against black men in particular is because of a racist stereotype of black men as being dangerous, violent. And so there's, I think, often a subconscious reaction in viewing an African American male that is responsible for the some of the problems we're having right now with police violence against African Americans. It's this kind of social label put on people, and this can be internalized. You know, I've been teaching at Grambling. This is my 30th year. It's also my final year. I'm planning to retire come the end of spring semester in May. Some of my students over the years have internalized this and seem to feel like that they can't perform up to the level of other groups. And I think that's terribly unfortunate, to let somebody else define you that way. It's terribly destructive. And so there is a problem if you belong to a group that society labels as inferior. Not only does that work from the outside in terms of putting limits on you, it can also be internalized. Basically, if you buy into that, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you talk to any of our student athletes, you know, a big thing in athletics is confidence. You know, if you don't think you can win the game, you're beaten before the game starts. But that's not just true in sports. It's true in life. That if you accept this label that you're not up to snuff, you won't be, because you don't try. You think it's hopeless. You don't expect it of yourself. Now, do I have an easy solution for this? No, I don't. Wish I did, but I don't. But I think that is the kind of thing that Malcolm X is talking about here. And it correctly points out the silliness of it, but also the danger in it. And of course, this is not just done along racial lines. The next article by Sherry Ortner talks about it in terms of women and how universally women are frequently seen as subordinate to men. And she argues that the evidence of that evidence that a particular culture considers women inferior would be things in society that explicitly devalue women, uh, symbolic devices such as the attribution of defilement that are implicitly place an inferior valuation. Um, an example of that would be um, in the Old Testament, where any kind of bodily discharge renders a person ritually impure, unclean, and of course that happens to women once a month, right? And so that association with impurity. Um, and the third evidence would be a structural arrangement in society that excludes women from the highest levels of social power. And an example of that would be the fact that women only got the right to vote in 1920. Okay? Um, and in some places, Saudi Arabia only in the last few years has given women the right to vote. So those would be examples of that. Now, and so she argues that virtually every society is guilty of this, and she thinks at least um, in 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 the West, um, the that mind body dualism that we've been talking about um, is partly to blame. Um, and she argues that women have been identified with nature, masculinity identified with culture, and of course, humanity overcomes nature through culture. And so uh, the identification of women um, with nature in some way, at least in terms of being closer to nature um, than men, is a way that societies demean women and um, put them in a position subordinate um, to men. Which raises the question of gender roles. You know, identity, um, social identity carries with it social roles, expectations for how we're to act and conduct ourselves and live our lives. And is it possible to live in a society that doesn't have some kind of gender role? I'm not sure. I can't think of any society that doesn't have some kind of gender role expectations. Um, but it does seem to me that if we're going to have these expectations, that we need to keep them flexible, um, not hard and fast. Um, you know, traditionally, women are seen as nurturing, um, men as aggressive, despite the fact, of course, that men can be nurturing and women can be aggressive. Um, I mean, there are times my wife and I have been married for 41 years. There have been times when I was the chief cook because our schedule at the time um, worked out that way better. Um, I remember when I was a pastor in Tallahassee, one of the women in the church was just shocked because my wife would go away for a weekend for a minister's mates um, retreat with a organization for clergy spouses, mostly wives, um, though even at that point in the 1980s, where there were a number of women clergy around. Um, and so some ministers' mates were men. Um, but she was just shocked that I would let her do that, and I would take care of our two little girls at the time. It was before our son was born. Um, it I encouraged my wife to do that. And guys can take care of babies. They're ours too. Um, and Ferguson argues that gender roles, in fact, um, derive from um, define sexual orientation, and that if we did away with gender roles, all children would be bisexual. I don't know how you would I don't know how you would go about proving or disproving that, because there is really no way to get access to a state before we begin to develop our social identity, because our social identity develops very, very young. Um, think about how we go about um, identifying ourselves by our name, which is probably the most basic social identity we have. You know, well, that actually starts when we're very, very young, when our parents start calling us by this name. Um, and they give us positive reinforcement when we respond to it. And so I don't know how you'd know one way or the other, frankly. Now, the last the next reading by Deidre McCloskey gets at this from a different angle, and that is a person who is transgender. As he transitioned from being male to being female. And what this article gets at, I think, is why people do this. And the answer for McCloskey, and I think for most, if not all, people who transgender, is because their kind of inner sense of who they are, gender wise, doesn't match the body they're in. I don't know how that happens. I don't know that it matters. Um, it's points out the complexity that gender identity is not simply a uh, a physical thing, a function of the body and which set of genitalia you happen to have. That it's something deeper and psychological involved in it. The last readings in the chapter that you have really challenge the idea of there being a single self. Hermann Hesse in Steppenwolf argues that we have not one self or even two selves. You know, the kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde phenomenon, but in fact multiple selves that were made up like an onion of layers. And likewise, Irigaray argues this for women, that a woman's natural self is not a single self, but multiple selves. Genevieve Lloyd criticizes a different concept of the self, and that is the association of male with rational, female with irrational or emotional, and the elevation of reason over emotion. Has really hamstrung women in their, not only their place in society, but their their ability to develop and be who they are. That this division between reason and the non-rational is a false dichotomy. The chapter concludes with some Eastern thought and the idea of that the self is actually a fiction. That it's ignorance. You have a selection from the Dhammapada, one of the Buddhist scriptures, um, about subjugation of self. Um, you must conquer yourself before you can subdue anyone else, um, and how the the self um, is really the source of our problem. Um, in Buddhism, the the thing that causes all of our suffering, all of our unhappiness in life, is craving for self, and the solution to this is to eliminate all such desire. Cut down the whole forest of desires, not just one tree. Danger comes out of the forest of desires. Cut out the love of self. First step is to recognize that there is no self. Buddhism has a concept that there is no soul. There is no Atman, no inner self. Usually translated as soul, but you can translate it as self, that there is no self. That the whole idea of me as a distinct individual being is wrong. And in fact, the concept of nirvana involves getting rid of this concept of self. The difference between a Hindu or a Buddhist concept of nirvana and a Christian or Muslim concept of heaven, while they're much alike, it's a state of pure happiness and joy with no pain whatsoever. The difference is that Christians and Muslims think of individual souls going to heaven and being able to recognize their other individual souls. You don't get that in a Hindu or Buddhist concept of nirvana. There is joy, but there is no me experiencing the joy. The idea of nirvana is in Hinduism is the absorption of the self into what amounts to God, the world soul, Brahman. In Buddhism, it is the extinction of the self, the release into nothingness. In fact, the word nirvana literally means nothing. And so this concept of the self in Buddhist thought is really the source of all of our problems. Likewise, in the Tao Te Ching, the source of our unhappiness is self. The reason I have an enemy is because I have self. If I no longer had a self, I would no longer have an enemy. Love the whole world as if it were yourself. And there is a paradox in Taoism that the way to live whole and complete and happy is to learn to go with the flow of nature. If you want to become whole, you must let yourself become broken. To not assert oneself. That is the way the Tao. When we try to assert ourself, our will, when we try to make the world what we want it to be, that is when we wind up dissatisfied and hurting in life, because it's like if I were somehow or other in crossing the bridge over the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, if I somehow were to fall into the river, the worst thing that I can try to do is to fight the current. I'm not going to win that battle. The only thing that can happen if I fight against that current is that I'm going to exhaust myself and drown. I need to let the current carry me downstream and gently angle for the bank. Don't try to fight it. I grew up in Florida, and they taught us from the beginning about what happens if you caught in a rip current in the ocean. Don't fight it. Let it carry you out. Swim across it. If you try to swim against it, it is way stronger than you are. That's the way the Tao is, the flow of nature. If we fight against it, we're not going to win that battle. Learn to live in harmony with it, to embrace whatever comes. That is the way to happiness and fulfillment according to Taoism.